Question 1. What does Calvin see as the main emphasis in the phrase, "You shall eat before the Lord"? Answer. The emphasis is not merely on eating, but on the place. Calvin points out that this phrase once again stresses that worship and sacrifice must be centralized in the place God has chosen. This is not a casual religious gathering, but a divinely appointed order of worship. Question 2. What specifically is the place which the Lord will choose? Why could Moses speak this way at that time? Answer. Calvin clearly states that this place is Jerusalem. Although in Moses' time the ark had not yet been permanently settled, not until the time of David, Moses speaks prophetically. Once God chooses a permanent dwelling place for his name, that location becomes the only legitimate center of sacrifice. Question 3. Why must sacrifice be restricted to one place? Wouldn't multiple locations be more convenient? Answer. Calvin's answer is very clear: to prevent the corruption of worship and to preserve the unity of faith. He argues that once worship is scattered, human inventions inevitably arise, and in his view, all such man-made innovations are profanations of God's worship. Question 4. Why are tithes and firstborn offerings mentioned together in chapter 12, yet seem different here? Answer. Calvin explains that in chapter 12, Moses indeed places tithes and firstborn offerings under the same regulation. However, here the law is somewhat relaxed. If the distance is too great, agricultural produce may be converted into money. This does not nullify the law, but represents a practical adjustment made in accordance with the spirit of the law. Question 5. Is Moses primarily discussing the tithe here? Answer. Strictly speaking, no. Calvin points out that Moses is primarily addressing votive offerings and free will offerings, though he mentions the tithe alongside them. This leads to the real question: must the entire tithe also be brought to Jerusalem? Question 6. Why is it unreasonable to require that all tithes be brought to Jerusalem? Answer. Because the tithe was meant to provide for the Levites, and the Levites were dispersed throughout the land. If all tithes had to be transported to Jerusalem, it would mean either. Calvin frankly states that such an arrangement would effectively cause the Levites to starve. Question 7. How did some commentators attempt to resolve this difficulty? Why does Calvin reject their view? Answer. Some commentators argued that the people voluntarily selected portions of the tithe to bring to Jerusalem during the festivals. Calvin rejects this interpretation because it would effectively require the people to give away 4/5 and keep only 1/5 at home. Such a burden would be excessive and inconsistent with the spirit of the law. Question 8. What does Calvin consider a more reasonable practical arrangement? Answer. His understanding is as follows. This preserves institutional unity without disrupting practical living. Question 9. Why is it unlikely that the people brought everything to Jerusalem and the Levites then transported it back? Answer. Calvin regards that as pointless labor. The back-and-forth transport would waste manpower and serve no useful purpose, entirely inconsistent with the wisdom of God in establishing the law. Question 10. Why does Calvin specifically mention the command for the Levites to faithfully deliver a portion to the priests? Answer. Because if all tithes had originally been placed entirely in the hands of the priests, there would have been no need to command the Levites to transfer a portion. This actually demonstrates that the Levites first collected the tithes locally and only afterward distributed portions according to regulation. Question 11. What is Calvin's final conclusion? Answer. His conclusion has two parts. 1. The ordinary tithe, collected locally by the Levites for their livelihood. 2. Another kind of tithe, mentioned later in the passage, brought to the sanctuary as a holy offering, a public declaration of service and obedience before God. Question 12. In the end, what is the meaning of the phrase, "You shall eat before the Lord"? This phrase is not merely a legal requirement, but God's wise arrangement to centralize worship so that the people gathered together during the festivals.